Chapter 5. Into War. At the University of Southern California, Louis found himself on a campus infested with world-class track athletes. He spent mornings in class and afternoons training with his best friend, Peyton Jordan, a sensationally fast sprinter. Jordan had seen nothing but Jesse Owens' back at the 1936 Olympic trials, and like Louis, was aiming for gold in Tokyo. In the evenings, Louis, Jordan, and their teammates wedged into Louis' 31 Ford and drove to Torrance for Louis Zamperini's spaghetti, considering themselves so close to family that Sylvia once found a high jumper asleep on her bed. In his spare time, Louis crashed society weddings, worked as a movie extra, and harassed his housemates with practical jokes, replacing their deviled ham with cat food and milk with milk of magnesia. He pursued co-eds by all means necessary, once landing a date with a beauty by hurling himself into the side of her car, then pretending to have been struck. Between classes, Louis, Jordan, and their friends congregated near the administration building, sitting at the foot of the statue of Tommy Trojan, the symbol of USC. On some days, they were joined by a neatly dressed Japanese émigré who lingered on the edges of the group. His name was Kunichi James Sasaki. Known as Jimmy, he had come to America in his late teens and settled in Palo Alto, where he had endured the social misery of attending elementary school as an adult. Among Louis' friends, no one would remember that Sasaki studied at USC, but they all recalled his quiet, anodyne presence. Saying almost nothing, he smiled without interruption. Sasaki was an ardent track fan, and he sought Louis' acquaintance. Louis was especially impressed with Sasaki's scholarliness. Prior to coming to USC, Jimmy said he had earned degrees at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Bonding over shared interests in sports and music, the two became good friends. Louis and Jimmy had something else in common. Sometime over the course of the friendship, Louis learned that his friend was making daily trips to Torrance. He asked Jimmy if he lived there, and Jimmy said no. He explained that he was concerned about the poverty of his Japanese homeland, and was going to Torrance to give lectures to locals of Japanese ancestry, encouraging them to send money and foil from cigarette packs and gum wrappers to Japan to help the poor. Louis admired his friend for his efforts, but found it odd that he would travel to Torrance every day, given how few Japanese lived there. Jimmy Sasaki wasn't what he seemed. He had never attended Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. His friends thought him about 30. He was, in fact, nearly 40. He had a wife and 2 daughters, though neither Louis nor his friends knew that they existed. Though he spent a lot of time on campus and led everyone to believe that he was a student, he was not. He had graduated from USC some 10 years earlier, with a BA in political science. Neither Louis nor anyone else knew that Jimmy's attempts to pass as a student were apparently an elaborate ruse. On USC's track team, Louis was a juggernaut. Focused on winning in Tokyo in 1940, he smashed record after record at multiple distances and routinely buried his competition by giant margins, once winning a race by 100 yards. By the spring of 1938, he'd whittled his mile time down to 4 minutes 13.7 seconds, some 7 seconds off the world record, which now stood at 4 minutes 6.4 seconds. His coach predicted that Louis would take that record down. The only runner who could beat him, the coach said, was Seabiscuit. One afternoon in 1938, Glenn Cunningham stood in the Los Angeles Coliseum locker room, talking with reporters after winning a race. "There's the next mile champion," he said, leveling his eyes across the room. "When he concentrates on this distance, he'll be unbeatable." The reporters turned to see who Cunningham was looking at. It was Louis, blushing to the roots of his hair. In the 1930s, track experts were beginning to toss around the idea of a 4-minute mile. Most observers, including Cunningham, had long believed that it couldn't be done. In 1935, when Cunningham's record of 4 minutes 6.7 seconds reigned, science weighed in. Studying data on human structural limits, compiled by Finnish mathematicians, famed track coach Brutus Hamilton penned an article for Amateur Athlete magazine stating that a 4-minute mile was impossible. The fastest a human could run a mile, he wrote, was 4 minutes 1.6 seconds. Pete disagreed. Since the Olympics, he'd been certain that Louis had a 4-minute mile in him. Louis had always shaken this off, but in the spring of 38, he reconsidered. His coach had forbidden him to run hills on the mistaken but common belief that it would damage his heart. But Louis didn't buy the warnings. Every night that May, he climbed the Coliseum fence, dropped into the stadium, and ran the stairs until his legs went numb. By June, his body was humming, capable of speed and stamina beyond anything he'd ever known. He began to think that Pete was right, and he wasn't alone. Running pundits, including Olympic champion sprinter Charlie Paddock, published articles stating that Louis could be the first 4-minute man. Cunningham, too, had changed his mind. He thought that 4 minutes might be within Louis's reach. Zamperini, Cunningham told a reporter, was more likely to crack 4 minutes than he was. In June 1938, Louis arrived at the NCAA championships in Minneapolis, gunning for 4 minutes. Spilling over with eagerness, he babbled to other athletes about his new training regimen, his race strategy, and how fast he might go. Word spread that Louis was primed for a superlative performance. On the night before the race, a coach from Notre Dame knocked on Louis's hotel room door, a grave expression on his face. He told Louis that some of his rival coaches were ordering their runners to sharpen their spikes and slash him. Louis dismissed the warning, certain that no one would do such a thing deliberately. He was wrong. Halfway through the race, just as Louis was about to move for the lead, several runners shouldered around him, boxing him in. Louis tried repeatedly to break loose, but he couldn't get around the other men. Suddenly, the man beside him swerved in and stomped on his foot, impaling Louis's toe with his spike. A moment later, the man ahead began kicking backward, cutting both of Louis's shins. A third man elbowed Louis's chest so hard that he cracked Louis's rib. The crowd gasped. Bleeding and in pain, Louis was trapped. For a lap and a half, he ran in the cluster of men, unable to get free, restraining his stride to avoid running into the man ahead. At last, as he neared the final turn, he saw a tiny gap open before him. He burst through, blew past the race leader, and with his shoe torn open, shins streaming blood and chest aching, won easily. He slowed to a halt, bitter and frustrated. When his coach asked him how fast he thought he had gone, Louis replied that he couldn't have beaten 4:20. The race time was posted on the board. From the stands came a sudden, whoa. Louis had run the mile in 4 minutes, 8.3 seconds. It was the fastest NCAA mile in history, and the 5th fastest outdoor mile ever run. Louis had missed the world record by 1.9 seconds. His time would stand as the NCAA record for 15 years. Weeks later, Japan withdrew as host of the 1940 Olympics, and the Games were transferred to Finland. Adjusting his aspirations from Tokyo to Helsinki, Louis rolled on. He won every race he contested in the 1939 school season. In the early months of 1940, in a series of Eastern indoor miles against the best runners in America, he was magnificent, taking 2 seconds and 2 close fourths, twice beating Cunningham and getting progressively faster. In February at the Boston Garden, he ran a 4:08.2, 0.6 of a second short of the fastest indoor mile ever run. At Madison Square Garden 2 weeks later, he scorched a 4:07.9, caught just before the tape by the great Chuck Fensky, whose time equaled the indoor world record. With the Olympics months away, Louis was peaking at the ideal moment. As Louis blazed through college, far away, history was turning. In Europe, Hitler was laying plans to conquer the continent. In Asia, Japan's leaders had designs of equal magnitude. Poor in natural resources, its trade crippled by high tariffs and low demand, Japan was struggling to support a growing population. Eyeing their nation's resource-rich neighbors, Japan's leaders saw the prospect of economic independence and something more. Central to the Japanese identity was the belief that it was Japan's divinely mandated right to rule its fellow Asians, whom it saw as inherently inferior. There are superior and inferior races in the world, said the Japanese politician Nakajima Chikuei in 1940, and it is the sacred duty of the leading race to lead and enlighten the inferior ones. The Japanese, he continued, are the sole superior race of the world. Moved by necessity and destiny, Japan's leaders planned to plant the blood of the Yamato, Japanese, race on their neighboring nation's soil. They were going to subjugate all of the Far East.